Your book titles this chapter Self-Monitoring, but I think that that's a little deceptive. What we're really going to be learning about in this chapter is how to identify bias. Yes, your own bias, which does involve some self-monitoring, but also bias in the author. You also are going to learn about worldviews and assumptions and persuasive techniques such as ethos, pathos, and logos. So there are some questions that you should be able to answer by the time you finish this chapter. Um, you'll be asking questions about worldview, bias, the writing situation, cognitive dissonance, and the three persuasive techniques of ethos, pathos, and logos. These are the terms that you'll need to know after you've finished reviewing this chapter. So if any of them still seem unfamiliar to you, you'll want to go back and make sure that you review that material. Some of this will be covered in today's video. Some of these terms can be found in your book. So self-monitoring really involves thinking in an organized way and being able to recognize bias in worldview when we encounter it. And also recognizing that we ourselves definitely have a bias and a worldview from which we view or read or encounter material, and that sometimes can change how we interact with a text or content. We have to learn sometimes how to change our minds. We've talked about this a couple of different times in previous videos throughout this course, that being a critical thinker does involve being willing to change your mind. And when you encounter new information, you have to be willing to say, hey, this changes things. It might change my beliefs. And that's a tricky thing, I think, for people to do, because we get very locked into our own beliefs, if you remember the status quo bias from last chapter. So some tips for organized thinking. In order to think carefully and critically about something, you should try thinking about one thing at a time, break arguments down into pieces so that you can evaluate them appropriately. You need to be able to use tools and resources such as graphic organizers to put material into order so that you can clearly understand it. That's one of the skills that we will use when we're writing our papers this semester. We'll be using planners to arrange material. And you have to be able to think systematically, think your way through a process based on a series of steps. So worldview is one of the major components of self-monitoring because each person has their own worldview. It's a product of your experiences and how you were raised and who you are. So we all have one, and it helps us interpret the world around us. We have to be able to, think about big picture ideas, things like human nature and life and death and equality and responsibilities and relationships and ethical considerations. And how we do that depends on how we were raised and where we were raised and who we are and what experiences we've had. And it's really important that you be able to identify your own worldview and other people's worldviews so that you can figure out how it's impacting the way that they are thinking about a topic or a reading. So if you're reading an article about technology, right, you want to think about the worldview of the author. How are they approaching this topic, and how is that similar or different to the way you would approach this topic? So some things that impact our worldview include things like gender, race, nationality, region, like where we were born, urban versus rural, our religion, our economic status, our age, our career path, what profession we're in, our sexual preference. So all of those things can come together to create a worldview. And really, no two people have the exact same worldview, right? If you think about it, no two people will have the exact same set of circumstances or experiences. But it is worth noting that you probably share parts of your worldview with other people around you. So it's important to be able to identify not just your own worldview, but also the worldview of the author or the worldview that's being presented in a text. It can stop us from being a good critical thinker when we rely on our worldview to answer questions and we choose not to think critically about those questions instead. So for example, a hot topic over the past several years has been, gay rights and gay marriage. So if you are thinking critically about the topic, you have to be able to set aside your existing worldview. You might already have a set of beliefs that come from your family upbringing, your background, where you were raised, the religion that you were raised with. All of those things would impact your existing beliefs. And it's not wrong to have that worldview or those beliefs, but if you want to really be a good critical thinker, you have to be willing to recognize what those things are and kind of set them aside so that you can think objectively and critically about the topic at hand instead of just relying on your worldview to make a decision for you. Worldview and bias are related. Everybody has a worldview. It's important, it's vital, but it can sometimes create challenges for people. So we have to kind of go beyond our worldview, right? Because a worldview is simplistic. It doesn't address every single circumstance or all of the complexity that might be involved in a topic. It's also something that we don't really think about very often. Our worldview is just kind of our norm. It's the way we see the world. So we don't even sometimes realize that our worldview is coloring the way we are seeing a topic. We just assume that the way we are thinking about something is normal. It's the way everyone thinks about this. But that's not true, because other people's worldviews are just as valid as ours. And we have to be able to stop and see that. We also have to avoid making assumptions based on our worldviews, because that can lead to us being biased, right? Bias is when we are unfairly looking at only one side of a story or an issue instead of objectively weighing both sides of the issue or looking at all of the points of view. So we want to avoid bias as much as possible. When we fail to think critically about the evidence, right, and when we only use our worldview to inform our decisions, then we are being biased. So it's important to be able to identify bias, not only in ourselves when we're engaging with new content, but also in the texts that we read. We have to be able to determine whether an author is being biased. Are they presenting a one-sided view of an issue, or are they fairly and objectively weighing both sides? It is worth noting at the bottom of this screen here, there is a difference between bias and biased. Bias is a noun, so you would say the author has a bias or there is a bias in the article. But if we're using it as an adjective, you would add the ed to the word here. So it would be the author is biased, not the author is bias, if that makes sense. I think this is hard for students because it's very hard to hear those last two letters. That ed doesn't really come across very well verbally, so it's easy when you're writing to get them mixed up. So how do we identify bias in a text? We examine the writing situation and ask some questions about the author and about the content. We try to find out when and where this was published and what their purpose is. If you think their purpose is persuasive, that's a good clue that there is some bias, right? Because they're taking a side and they're trying to convince you to do something. Whereas something that is more objective and unbiased might be to inform. So purpose and bias can be linked. It's also important to examine the language in the text. We talked about connotation in a previous chapter, those positive and negative words that contribute to the author's tone. By identifying the tone, we can also try to determine whether or not the author is biased for or against something. If you're biased for something, then you're going to use a lot of positive words and try to really talk it up and make it sound positive and exciting and fantastic and get your audience, worked up and excited about it. But if you're biased against something, you're going to use a lot of negative words because you want to influence your audience to feel very negatively about this topic. So those are some key components to identifying bias. It is important when we're talking about bias in a text to recognize cognitive dissonance, which is the mental discomfort that we all feel whenever we are trying to somehow address two contradictory ideas at the same time. So these are some good examples here on the screen. Chantel knows that she should study for her math final, but she really wants to go out, right? So you have these two competing ideas, and they are both equally valid, and it feels very stressful mentally, right? It's mental stress, psychological discomfort. Another one is that Jose loves to eat junk food, but he's just completed a health unit that explains why sugar is so bad for the body. So knowing that something is bad for you, but really wanting to do it anyway, is a kind of cognitive dissonance. And one of the ways to reduce that stress is to rationalize, right? To come up with reasoning that sort of justifies or rationalizes a bad decision. In the last example here, Miranda really looks up to her friend Dante, but he asks if he can copy her science homework. The way to reduce the stress there for Miranda, she might decide that, oh, well, Dante's really a good person, but he just is really jammed up right now. He's really busy, and he just couldn't get this one thing done, and it's just a little homework assignment. It's not worth a lot of points. It's not a big deal, right? And so by rationalizing his choice, she reduces her own cognitive dissonance. So a few more things to discuss. We have metacognition, which is the idea of thinking about your own thinking process. So as you're reading content, you should be asking yourself how you feel about this material. How are you reacting? Are you biased? Do you understand what you're being, what you're trying to, what the author is trying to convince you of? So metacognition is an important step in the process to be able to ask yourself, like, how am I engaging with this material? The last part of this chapter involves 3 persuasive techniques. These are used all the time. They're used in essays, in arguments, they're used in advertising and commercials. So ethos, pathos, and logos are all 3 different modes of persuasion, and you should be able to identify them. So ethos is a form of argument that's based on character or authority and respect. Ads that use ethos often include celebrities or people in uniform, people that we would consider an expert. So in this example here, obviously Julia Roberts could certainly be considered an expert in makeup. It's her job to look nice, to be pretty, that's that the face that she shows the world is her brand. So we trust in her, right, to tell us which makeup is good, which we should buy. So that's why a lot of companies choose celebrities or experts to promote their products, because that relies on the ethos persuasive technique. Pathos relies on emotion instead, and that emotion could be fear, desire, sympathy, or anger. So anytime an ad or an argument is trying to stir up your emotions and make you feel angry or empathetic, that's an example of pathos. And the final example is logos, which is a form of argument based on logic and facts and numbers. So anytime an argument is trying to rationally, logically persuade you of something, that's an example of logos. So hopefully in this chapter, you have covered worldview, bias, metacognition, cognitive dissonance, and persuasive techniques. And if you still have any questions, please reach out to me.